The snow had been falling since dusk, blanketing the quiet streets of Willow Glen in a silence so thick it swallowed even the wind. Officer Reed Dawson pulled his cruiser into the narrow driveway of his two-story colonial on Pinehurst Lane. The headlights cut through the flurries like a pair of weary eyes, then faded as he killed the engine. It was almost 11 p.m. Reed stepped out, boots crunching against the hardened snow, his breath fogging in the bitter air. The day had been long. Paperwork, noise complaints, a hit-and-run with no license plate. He wanted nothing more than to sink into his old couch, pour a splash of bourbon, and forget the world. But then he saw it. A shape moved in the dim pool of light under the street lamp, crouched low near his mailbox. At first it looked like a pile of snow or a trash bag blown off the curb. But then it moved, frantic, clawing, almost convulsing. Reed's hand instinctively dropped to his holster as he stepped forward. "Hey!" he barked. The creature turned. A German shepherd, older, ribs protruding beneath a matted sable coat, stared up at him with wild eyes. One ear was torn and bent, the other standing tall like it still remembered its duty. The dog was scratched, limping, its hind leg dragging slightly in the snow. But its movements were sharp, deliberate. It barked once, loud, then turned back to the mailbox and resumed its violent scratching, paws raking the frozen metal as if something inside was trying to escape. "What the hell?" Reed's instinct screamed caution. Something in the dog's urgency, the way it barked and then looked back at him, over and over. It wasn't random. It wasn't desperation. It was trying to tell him something. He reached the box, brushing snow from the latch, and unhooked it. Then his heart stopped. Inside, tucked between layers of crumpled paper and torn advertisements, sat a metallic cylinder. A small red light blinked steadily on its surface. 5 seconds. He didn't count out loud. He didn't move. 4. His training kicked in like a shot of ice water to the brain. No tremor in his fingers, no wasted breath. 3. He grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Dawson. I have a possible IED at my residence. Immediate EOD response. Priority 1-2. He backed up slowly, adrenaline roaring through his veins. 1. Then, the blinking stopped. He blinked once, unsure if it was his mind playing tricks. But the device remained still. The red light was gone. He stared at the dog. It had sat down in the snow, panting, chest heaving, watching him. It had saved him. When the bomb squad arrived minutes later, their assessment was grim. Real device. Crude but deadly. The timer had frozen, likely due to a wiring flaw or a glitch. Either way, it was armed. Live. "You're lucky you didn't step into the blast zone," said the EOD tech, a burly man in a bomb suit, sweat freezing on his brow despite the cold. "Hell of a thing." This wasn't a prank. Reed nodded slowly, eyes drifting back to the shepherd still sitting at the edge of the yard. Snow had begun to settle on its back, but it hadn't moved. The tech followed his gaze. "That your dog?" Reed shook his head. "Never seen him before tonight?" The man grunted. "Well, he just saved your life." Later, after the scene was cleared, after yellow tape wrapped around the mailbox like a warning to the world, Reed found himself standing on the porch. The dog had followed him, at a distance, never whining, never begging, just waiting. He opened the front door and stood aside. "Come on," he said quietly. The shepherd hesitated for a heartbeat, then stepped over the threshold. Inside, Reed dug out an old blanket from the hall closet and spread it near the fireplace. The house still smelled faintly of coffee and winter air. The dog circled twice before lowering himself onto the blanket, letting out a low breath. He didn't fully relax. One eye remained open, his ears twitching at the slightest creak of the house. Reed poured a glass of water into a shallow dish and set it down. The dog drank, slow and measured. "You're not just some stray," Reed said. He sat down across from the animal and studied him. Scars along the leg, a stiff limp, torn ear. His body bore stories of survival, of battles endured and battles lost. But it was his eyes that stayed with Reed, sharp, alert, aware. This wasn't a pet. This was a soldier. He looked like he had been forgotten by the world and yet had still shown up at Reed's door when it mattered most. "You've seen things," Reed muttered. "And tonight, you saw something before I did." The fire crackled softly behind them. Outside, the snow thickened, blanketing the town in silence once more. Reed leaned back, arms crossed. Then, after a long pause, he said aloud, "Shadow." The dog didn't move at first. Then his ear twitched. He turned his head slightly, as if acknowledging the name. "Shadow it is." Reed Dawson didn't sleep that night. Not because of the bomb, not because of fear, but because something about that dog stirred memories he hadn't touched in years, of brothers lost in Afghanistan, of instincts honed in firefights and forgotten streets. Shadow didn't sleep either. And somehow, that made Reed feel less alone. At 3:17 a.m., Reed stood at the window, watching snowflakes drift under the street lamp. He could see the mailbox, scarred, twisted now, and empty. He turned back toward the fireplace. Shadow was still awake, still watching. Not fearful, not frantic, just present. "You saved my life tonight," Reed whispered. Shadow blinked once, and in that moment, neither man nor dog knew the darkness that was still coming. But for now, they were alive. And for the first time in a long time, Reed felt like he had a partner. A warning had arrived on 4 paws, not barking, not growling, just clawing at a mailbox in the middle of a winter night. And the cry for help hadn't gone unheard. The night after the bomb scare was colder, not just in temperature, but in the way the air settled, heavy, still like the world was holding its breath. Reed Dawson had double-checked every lock, every window, every point of entry in the house. The twisted mailbox had been removed by the bomb squad, but its absence left a hollow pit in his gut. Like the threat was still circling, waiting. Shadow lay by the front door, unmoving, yet utterly aware. His body, lean but powerful, was coiled like a spring. His ears twitched every time the wind scraped a branch across the roof. His eyes never left the hallway. Reed poured himself a cup of black coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the Glock resting beside him. Not holstered, not hidden. His badge was still clipped to his belt, though he was off duty. At 2:14 a.m., Shadow growled. It was low, barely audible, but Reed heard it like a gunshot. He was already moving before the growl grew into a full bark. Shadow lunged toward the back of the house, claws skidding on hardwood as he rounded the corner. Then, glass shattered. Reed dove for the hallway as the back door burst open. 3 figures poured into the house, black-clad, faces covered. One held a crowbar, another carried what looked like a hunting knife. The third had something Reed couldn't see, but Shadow didn't wait to find out. The shepherd launched himself at the man with the blade. His growl became a roar as he collided with the intruder. The man yelped as Shadow clamped down on his forearm, driving him backward into the wall. The knife skittered across the floor. The other 2 hesitated. Split-second confusion that gave Reed the opening he needed. "Police!" he shouted. The man with the crowbar lunged toward him. Reed fired once, into the floor. Warning shot, deliberate, loud enough to rattle them, not kill. It worked. The intruders scrambled. One grabbed the injured man's shoulder and dragged him out through the shattered door, curses muffled under their masks. The third was last out, slipping on the snow-drenched porch before vanishing into the dark. Reed didn't chase them. Not yet. Instead, he dropped to a knee beside Shadow. The dog stood over the dropped knife, panting hard. Fur bristled, but not bleeding. A strip of cloth, part of a jacket sleeve, hung from his teeth. His eyes met Reed's. There was no panic, no confusion, only readiness. "Good boy," Reed whispered, reaching out slowly. Shadow didn't flinch. 15 minutes later, the sheriff's unit arrived, along with a young forensic tech named Mira Cho. She moved like a scalpel, precise, clean, already dusting prints on the doorknob before the others finished setting up the perimeter. "Looks like professional gear," Mira said, nodding toward the entry point. "But not military grade." More like black market surplus. Reed knelt near the kitchen door frame. A thin wire was lodged into the molding. He turned to Mira. "What is that?" She pulled it gently with tweezers, held it up. Detonator thread. Inert now. But someone tried to rig a trap here. Crude, but it could have worked. Reed's breath caught. It was happening again. Later, in the quiet aftermath, Reed sat alone with Shadow near the fireplace. His mind spun, connecting dots that hadn't surfaced in years. The bomb, the attack, the method. One name rose from the depths. Elias Vaughn. He hadn't heard that name in nearly a decade. A domestic extremist, ex-military engineer gone rogue, once tied to a string of bombings in the upper Midwest. Reed had worked the case years back, when he was just starting out. The unit had made arrests, closed the book. But Vaughn had never been caught. And now, the explosives used in the mailbox bore his signature. Shadow stirred beside him. Not because of a sound, but something in Reed's energy. The dog shifted closer, leaning into him like a quiet reminder. "You're not wrong. You're not alone." Reed studied the shepherd in the firelight. His eyes were sharp, too sharp for a stray. Every move was calculated. When he chased down the intruder, he hadn't gone for the kill. He'd gone for the arm, for the knife. Control. Training. Reed whispered, "Who were you before this?" He wasn't expecting an answer, but the dog stared back, steady. He didn't blink. Reed stood and walked to the closet. He pulled out a large duffel marked Evidence R. Dawson. Inside were old files he had kept against protocol, things he couldn't let go of. At the bottom, wrapped in plastic, was a half-burnt photo from the Vaughn case. It showed a training camp, deep in the woods, with Vaughn and his men posing beside makeshift explosives. And a dog, a German shepherd. It was blurry. The image was damaged. But Reed stared at the bent left ear of the dog in the photo. His stomach dropped. He turned, looked back at the shepherd lying by the fireplace. Same ear, same eyes, Shadow. He crossed the room slowly, crouched beside the dog. "You knew them, didn't you?" he said. "You were there." Shadow didn't move. "You ran." A beat of silence. Then Shadow lowered his head onto Reed's knee, gently. A gesture of trust, of truth. And just like that, everything changed. Reed no longer saw a stray. He saw a survivor. Someone who had escaped a life of violence, only to return to stop it from happening again. And the question that haunted him wasn't whether the threat was real. It was how many more lives would need saving, and whether he and Shadow could get there in time. The sun hadn't risen yet, but Reed Dawson was already awake, the faint blue glow of his laptop casting long shadows across his kitchen table. He hadn't slept. His eyes were red-rimmed, his fingers wrapped tight around a chipped mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Shadow lay curled under the window, but he wasn't asleep either. He didn't twitch or snore like a dog at peace. He just watched, quiet, still, listening to the silence. Reed clicked through the old files with a kind of grim focus, searching for something he couldn't name. The case was almost a decade old, buried in digital archives and half-shredded reports. Officially, the Vaughan investigation had been closed after a high-stakes raid in Cedar Township. 3 suspects were killed, 2 arrested. No bombs since. No Elias Vaughan. He leaned back in the chair and muttered, "We closed the wrong chapter." The group had called themselves Iron Wake, ex-military, disillusioned survivalists, men who believed the government owed them blood. Their bombs weren't flashy. They were precise, industrial, efficient, and always personal. He opened a folder marked IRW06 clearance and scrolled past mug shots and redacted memos until he froze on an old field photo. There, grainy and water-damaged, was a shot of a compound deep in the Appalachian pines, a squat warehouse with rusted siding. The caption read, "Suspected supply site. Last active ping 6 years ago." Reed whispered the words out loud. The old steel yard. It sat just outside Willow Glen's town limits, shuttered since the mid-90s after a furnace explosion gutted its core. He remembered chasing kids off its roof when he was a rookie. Lately, no one talked about it. The place was like a ghost, forgotten, fenced off, swallowed by vines and rust. Reed reached for his notebook and began sketching the town layout from memory. His house, the steel yard, the path behind the woods. That's when he heard it. A sharp bark from the backyard. Reed stood instantly. Shadow was already at the back door, tail stiff, ears forward. He was growling, not loud, but focused. Reed slipped on his boots, grabbed his flashlight, and followed the shepherd out into the snow-covered yard. The cold bit hard against his face, but he didn't flinch. Shadow led him straight toward the old firewood stack near the edge of the property, a spot no one had touched since early fall. The dog's body lowered, nose skimming the snow. Then he stopped, scratching, digging. Reed dropped beside him, brushing away snow and brittle wood until his fingers hit something hard. Metal. He pulled up a small, rusted box caked in mud and ice. It wasn't new, but it had been placed there deliberately. Reed popped it open and stared. Inside was a coil of copper wire, snapped at one end and burned at the other. Alongside it, wrapped in a torn oil rag, was a detonation cap, corroded but intact. And worse, it matched the same make used in the device found in his mailbox. His breath caught. He scanned the tree line, his hand going instinctively to the grip of his pistol. Nothing but wind and silence. "Somebody's been here," he muttered. Shadow sat beside him, ears still high, eyes trained towards the fence line. Reed stood, took one last look at the forest, and walked back inside. He placed the box gently on the kitchen table, opened his laptop again, and searched the original case files for known stash sites used by Iron Wake. 3 were listed, 2 were raided and cleared. The third. Unknown location, suspected near industrial corridor outside Willow Glen. He stared at the screen, jaw tightening. They'd been this close all along. He didn't need confirmation anymore. The old steel yard wasn't just a coincidence. It was part of something bigger, something unfinished. Shadow circled the table once, then sat beside him, chest high, waiting. Reed looked down. "You found that bomb? You found this? What else do you know, boy?" Shadow tilted his head slightly, then stood and walked to the back door again, turning once to glance over his shoulder. It was subtle, but it felt like an answer. Reed grabbed his coat and radio. He wasn't waiting for backup. Not yet. Not while the cold trail was still warm. The morning wind carried a sharpness that cut straight through wool and bone. Reed Dawson zipped his jacket to the collar as he stepped off his porch and crossed the frosted path to the house next door. Snow still clung to the hedges, glittering in the pale sun like glass dust. Shadow walked beside him, silent and alert. His steps were measured, his nose working the air. Annette Greer had lived in the house to the west of Reed's since before he joined the force. She was in her 70s, wiry and stubborn, with a sharp tongue softened only by kindness she pretended not to have. Most people knew her as the lady who left jars of homemade jam on their porch, but scolded them if they tried to say thank you. She opened the door before he could knock. "Took you long enough?" she said, eyes narrowing behind her thick glasses. "Figured you'd come ask." "Ask what?" Reed said. Annette stepped aside, motioning him in. "About the truck." Shadow hesitated on the threshold, but one nod from Reed, and he padded in. The old hardwood creaked beneath his paws. Annette walked slowly toward her living room, leaning heavier than usual on the carved cane her husband had left behind. "Night before last," she said. "About 2 a.m., I saw a dark pickup idling near the tree line behind your house. No lights? No reason to be there." "You get a plate?" Reed asked, already knowing the answer. She shook her head. "Too far." "But I remember the smell." Reed blinked. "The smell?" "Cigars," she said, settling into her armchair. "Not the kind you buy at a gas station." This was rich, oily, Dominican maybe. My late husband used to smoke the same ones when he felt nostalgic for his army days. Shadow suddenly stiffened, rising from his position near the door. His head turned toward the cracked window at the back of the house, nose twitching rapidly. Then came the growl, a low, rumbling warning that made the hair rise on the back of Reed's neck. "That's him," Annette whispered. "He smells it too." Reed moved to the window, but there was nothing outside except empty snow and the wind shaking the trees. Whatever scent lingered on the breeze was too faint for him. But Shadow smelled it. He knew it. And his reaction wasn't fear. It was recognition. Annette watched the shepherd with a strange softness in her expression. "That dog," she said. "He reminds me of someone." Reed turned from the window. "Someone." "My husband," she said, voice low. "Name was Henry. He was Army Corps of Engineers, spent a year training EOD dogs at Fort Kingsley after retirement. Said some of the best bomb dogs were the ones nobody expected. Rough-looking, troublemakers, but loyal as hell once they bonded." Reed's pulse ticked faster. "Did he ever talk about a shepherd?" Annette nodded slowly. "One. Said the dog came in after being pulled out of a busted-up raid. Scarred. Limped a bit. Ear half torn. They were going to wash him out, but Henry fought to keep him in the program. Said the dog wasn't broken, just done being lied to." Reed stepped closer. "Did he say what happened to that dog?" She shrugged. "Deployment, maybe. One day he just stopped talking about him. I figured the army took him back." Reed looked down at Shadow. The bent ear, the old limp, the eyes that missed nothing. "You remember her, don't you?" he asked quietly. Shadow walked toward Annette's chair and sat at her feet. Slowly, cautiously, she reached down. The shepherd didn't flinch. He leaned forward, gently resting his muzzle on her knee. Annette's voice cracked. "It's you." Reed felt like the floor tilted slightly beneath him. He crouched beside the dog, pressing a hand gently to his ribs. "You're not just any stray," he said. "You've been through the program." Maybe even trained with Henry. Annette reached toward the shelf beside her chair and pulled down a small tin box. Inside were photos, black and white, yellowed with age. One showed Henry in uniform, kneeling beside a younger version of a dog that looked eerily similar to the one now resting at her feet. "Did he have a name back then?" Reed asked. Annette squinted. "They just called him Kilo." "But Henry said that dog carried the soul of a man. Wouldn't leave your side once he chose you." Shadow didn't react to the old name. But his posture changed. Shoulders squared, eyes locked on Reed. I think he's got a new name now," Annette said softly. Reed stood, thoughts racing. The old steel yard, the bomb, the copper wire buried behind his house. Now this, a dog that had escaped from something he was never meant to survive, a handler who once believed in him, and a war that hadn't ended, not really. As they left the house, Annette leaned on the doorway. "Reed," she called. "If Shadow came back, it wasn't by accident." Reed looked at her. "Henry used to say the best soldiers don't always come back to salute. Sometimes they come back to finish what the rest of us couldn't." Shadow walked ahead of him, tail steady, gaze fixed on the trees beyond the snow-covered yards. And Reed knew whatever had started with that bomb in the mailbox was far from over. The wind had shifted by the time they reached the outskirts of Willow Glen. It came low through the trees now, brushing across the skeletal branches like something whispering secrets no one wanted to hear. Reed Dawson stood behind the rusted skeleton of a shipping container, peering through a pair of field binoculars. Beside him, Shadow stayed low, muscles tight, breath controlled. Ahead of them, 50 yards through frost-hardened brush, stood the abandoned steel yard. It looked dead. A carcass of bent beams and flaking corrugated metal, its old signage faded into unreadable rust. But Reed knew better. The silence was staged. This place wasn't forgotten. Not anymore. Jamie Kerr, the federal agent assigned to domestic terror cases in the tri-state area, crouched beside them. She was mid-30s, lean, steady-handed, with a mind like a lockpick, sharp and quiet until something clicked. Reed passed her the binoculars. Third window from the left, movement, just a shadow. She adjusted focus. Too regular for wind. Someone's watching from inside. Shadow suddenly growled. It was short, deep, and focused. Not fear, but alertness. Jamie followed his gaze toward the side entrance. A dented aluminum door, chain loosely hanging like it had been unlocked recently. Shadow moved toward it with surgical precision, stopping 5 feet out. Then he froze. One paw hovered in the air. His nose dropped an inch, ears flat. He turned to Reed, then glanced back at the ground. Reed's blood chilled. He rose carefully, stepping forward. "Jamie, wait." He moved beside Shadow and followed the dog's gaze. At first he saw nothing, just patches of frozen soil and dead leaves. Then he spotted it. A thin wire, barely visible, strung ankle-high across the entrance. Followed it to the side, and there it was. A crude trip mechanism anchored to a PVC pipe buried just beneath the threshold. Improvised explosive. Shrapnel-based. He exhaled slowly. "You just saved both our lives," Jamie muttered, crouching low to examine the wiring. She pulled out her phone and snapped photos. "This is military influence. Not homemade. Vaughn's signature all over it." Reed nodded once, then reached for the multi-tool in his pocket. "Help me kill it." Together, they disabled the trigger and cleared the wire. Once safe, they entered the steel yard through the side, weapons drawn, boots silent on concrete worn smooth by decades of abandonment. The interior stank of rust, oil, and something sharper, acrid, metallic. Shadow moved ahead, ears alert, sweeping the room like a living sensor. Past the shattered machinery and heaps of scrap, they found what they hadn't expected. A table. Clean. Organized. With a map laid flat and weighed down by bolts and washers. Jamie flicked on her penlight and leaned closer. Willow Glen. And it wasn't just a general area. The map was hand-marked with unsettling precision. School, water tower, church, Reed's house, each with timestamps, some circled, others crossed out. "This isn't random," Jamie said. "It's a sequence." A hit list. Reed leaned in. His heart dropped. "Look at the dates." The most recent? Tomorrow, 9:45 a.m. Jamie swore under her breath and began snapping photos of the entire map, then opened the drawers beneath the table. Inside were canisters of nitrate compound, fuse cords, and pre-cut copper. Another box held phones modified as remote detonators. Shadow gave a low warning sound again. Reed turned. Nothing yet. But the shepherd didn't growl for drama. He growled for reasons. Footsteps echoed faintly, far off, probably from the other end of the building. Jamie cursed. "We have to go." Now Reed hesitated. "Wait." Look tucked under the table, partially hidden beneath the map, was a file folder. Reed yanked it out and flipped it open. Printouts, surveillance photos. Of him, in uniform, at the station, in his yard. One showed him on the porch, coffee in hand, the same morning the mailbox bomb had been discovered. Another? Shadow, lying by the fire. "Someone's been watching me for weeks," Reed said quietly. Jamie didn't speak. She didn't need to. The air was heavy with realization. This wasn't about scaring him. It was about eliminating him. The tripwire, the break-in, the bomb. Shadow stepped closer, pressing his side into Reed's leg like a silent anchor. "Let's get this to a safe house," Jamie said, grabbing the folder. "We can't let this vanish." They exited the building just as another wind swept across the clearing. A bird took flight from the far trees, startled. Someone else was here, but hidden, for now. Back at the vehicle, Jamie loaded the files into a sealed evidence bag and turned to Reed. "This isn't just Vaughn playing lone wolf. This is structure, planning, possibly a cell." Reed looked back at the steel yard, now a silhouette of menace against the early dusk. "He's not just back," he said. "He never left." Shadow stood by the open car door, his eyes still locked on the yard. And for a moment, Reed wondered if the dog remembered more than any of them, not just where the threat had been, but what was still coming. The fluorescent light buzzed softly inside the precinct's evidence review room. Jamie Kerr sat in front of the workstation, sleeves rolled up, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Next to her, Reed leaned against the wall, arms crossed, while Shadow rested silently at his feet, eyes tracking every movement in the room. They were reviewing footage pulled from a hidden security camera found inside the steel yard's main storage office. Jamie had discovered the hardwired system buried behind a false electrical panel. Whoever installed it had intended to monitor traffic, either for security or blackmail. The grainy video played in silence. At first, it showed nothing unusual. Empty corridors, shifting light. Then the timestamp jumped. 3 nights ago, 2:12 a.m. A figure appeared in the frame. Tall, broad-shouldered. Moved with confidence, not caution. The man entered through the side door and walked directly to the back room. No hesitation, no flashlight. He knew exactly where to go. Jamie leaned forward, pausing the frame. "Reed," she said slowly. "Is that—" "I know that walk," he muttered. "Travis Merle." Reed stepped closer, jaw tightening. There was no mistaking the profile. The square chin. The way he tucked his thumb into his duty belt even when off shift. Merle wasn't just a familiar face. He was Reed's former shift commander, the man who had shut down his investigation into Vaughn 7 years ago. The same man who had sat in Reed's living room after the mailbox bomb, claiming to be concerned, offering vague reassurances about department priorities. Jamie pulled up the audio channel. Faint static, a few mumbled words. Then one phrase, clear as a bell. "Tell Vaughn we're getting too close." She stopped the tape. The room fell silent except for the hum of the heater and the distant echo of a phone ringing down the hall. Reed stared at the screen, his voice quiet and sharp. "He's not just involved. He's helping them." Jamie stood, her hands balling into fists. "He fed you disinformation, delayed backup the night of the break-in, gave Vaughn enough time to pull his people out of the steel yard before we arrived. And now he knows I'm back on the case," Reed said, "which means I just became a liability." Shadow stood, his posture stiffening. Jamie grabbed her phone and started encrypting the files for federal upload. "We get this to my office. With this video, we can open an internal investigation. We'll put Merle under watch immediately." Reed shook his head. "He's not going to wait around to be caught." A hard knock sounded on the door. Shadow turned sharply, issuing a sharp bark, a warning. Jamie pulled her pistol. "Who is it?" Silence. Reed motioned for her to back up as he stepped toward the door. Shadow moved ahead of him, body low and ready. Another knock. Then a voice. Calm. Friendly. "Reed. It's Travis. You in there?" Jamie looked at him. "What the hell?" Reed didn't answer. He motioned to kill the lights. The room dimmed instantly. Outside, Merle's voice continued, casual and relaxed. Too relaxed. "Wanted to talk to you about some updates on that bomb case. Got a couple theories. Mind letting me in?" Shadow's growl was deep now, chest rumbling with the sound of instinct. His eyes never left the door. Jamie whispered, "He's here to finish it." Reed nodded once. "He knows what we found." From outside, the door handle rattled, then silence, then retreating footsteps. They waited 10 full minutes before Reed slowly cracked the door and peered out. Empty. Hallway. Merle was gone. Jamie exhaled. He's going to try something else. Reed grabbed the drive and his jacket. "Not if we move first." They exited out the back of the precinct, using the fire stairs to avoid cameras. The air outside was colder now, heavier. Shadow led them to the car without a sound. He paused before getting in, sniffing the air, then glancing over his shoulder toward the dark edge of the parking lot. Reed followed his gaze. A vehicle sat across the street. Engine running, headlights off. He couldn't see the driver, but he didn't need to. They were being hunted, not just by Vaughn, by one of their own. And as Shadow leapt into the back seat, Reed's gut turned with a grim certainty. The game had changed. Now they were the target. The warehouse sat in a clearing by the old railway, half swallowed by overgrowth and time. Corrugated walls buckled under rust, and broken skylights cast pale streaks of moonlight onto the snow-patched gravel lot. But the inside told a different story. This place had been used recently. Reed Dawson checked the clip in his sidearm one more time and gave a sharp nod to Jamie Kerr. She was crouched beside him behind a stack of shipping crates, jaw clenched, eyes hard. Across from them, just out of sight, Shadow waited, motionless except for the slow, calculated rise and fall of his chest. They had tracked Vaughn here using GPS data hidden on the USB found in the steel yard. Buried deep in one encrypted folder was a set of coordinates and a logistics spreadsheet. Dates, delivery times, and raw materials flagged for use. Reed knew what that meant. Tonight wasn't just about surveillance. It was about stopping something before it detonated. Inside the warehouse, the faint sound of voices carried over the concrete floor. 2 men. No, 3. Moving crates, loading gear, and then a 4th voice, gravelly, measured, Elias Vaughn. Clock's ticking. "We move before first light," he said. "That town won't know what hit it." Reed's fingers tightened around the grip of his weapon. Jamie whispered, "Let me circle to the east." Flank position. Reed gave a subtle nod. Shadow moved with her for a few steps, then stopped. He turned, looked back at Reed, as if waiting. "With me," Reed said under his breath. Shadow returned to his side. They moved together along the outer wall, stepping over shattered pallets and a rusted tire rim. When they reached the entrance, Reed peered inside through a sliver in the siding. 3 men stood at a table covered in electrical wiring, ammonium nitrate bags, and plastic containers. In the center, Vaughn examined a schematic. He was older now, his hair grayer, frame thinner, but his movements were precise. Still a soldier in his own twisted war. Reed inhaled slowly, then kicked the door in. "Police! Drop everything!" Chaos exploded. One of the men lunged for a detonator on the table. Shadow was faster. The shepherd launched forward with a blur of motion and muscle, jaws clamping down on the man's arm before he could press the trigger. They tumbled to the ground. The device skittered away across the concrete. Jamie burst in from the side, tackling another suspect. A third tried to run, but Reed took him down with a sharp blow to the shoulder, gun still raised. Vaughn was already moving. He grabbed a metal rod from the shelf and swung it toward Jamie. She ducked, barely missing the strike, but tripped backward toward a nearby fuel drum. Vaughn tossed a flare. Reed's voice cracked through the air. "Jamie, move!" She tried. The flare hit the ground. Sparks jumped. Shadow reacted first. He lunged, knocked Jamie out of the way with his full weight, just as the flare landed in the fuel, slick and ignited in a burst of fire. The blast was brief, but violent. The shockwave threw Reed back against the crates. His ears rang. Smoke filled the air. Coughing, disoriented, he scrambled to his feet. Jamie was okay, bruised, shaken, but breathing. She was already pulling herself behind cover. Shadow didn't move. He lay near the base of the flame-charred drum, still breathing but curled tight, flank blackened by soot, fur singed along his ribs. He was alive, but hit hard. "Shadow!" Reed choked out. Then came a roar of movement. Vaughn charged out of the smoke, wielding the rod like a blade, his face twisted in rage, eyes wide with a hatred that had been simmering for years. "You ruined everything!" he screamed, swinging wildly. Reed blocked with his forearm, the rod catching his bicep. Pain shot through him. He retaliated with a punch to the gut, but Vaughn didn't back off. He slammed Reed against a support beam, the rod raised high for a final strike. Then, movement, a blur of fur and fire-scarred muscle. Shadow. With a guttural growl that carried both pain and fury, the shepherd hurled himself at Vaughn. His body crashed into the man's torso just as the rod came down. The two collapsed together in a tangled heap. Vaughn screamed as Shadow's teeth found flesh. Reed surged forward, yanking Vaughn's wrist back and snapping on the cuffs while the man thrashed beneath him. "It's over," Reed growled. Vaughn stilled, eyes blazing. "You don't get it." "This was bigger than me." Reed glanced at Shadow. "No," he said. "This was never about you." Minutes later, as backup sirens finally howled through the night, Jamie knelt beside Shadow. The dog was bleeding from the side, leg torn, but conscious. He looked up at Reed with tired eyes, tail thumping faintly against the cold floor. "You saved her," Reed whispered. Again. Shadow blinked, and through the smoke and ruin of the warehouse, the bond between man and dog burned brighter than the fires they had survived. The courtroom in Willow Glen was modest, aged oak benches, flagstone floors worn soft by decades of footsteps, and windows that rattled when the wind rolled off the hills. But that morning, it held the weight of justice. Reed sat near the front with Jamie beside him. Shadow lay quietly at his feet, leg bandaged, eyes alert despite the pain. A small patch of fur had been shaved along his side where the burns had been treated. He bore it with the same stoic grace he had shown in the field. Quiet, resilient, present. Across the aisle, Travis Merle sat with his head lowered. His uniform jacket had been stripped of its badge. He didn't look at anyone. He hadn't since the arrest. His lawyer, a pale man in a wrinkled suit, barely whispered as the charges were read aloud. Conspiracy, obstruction of justice, attempted murder. But it was the man 2 seats down that drew every eye. Elias Vaughn. Even in court, surrounded by U.S. Marshals, shackled at the ankles, Vaughn's eyes scanned the room like he was still mapping it for weakness. He wore a smirk that flickered with bitterness every time the judge spoke his name. The prosecution's evidence was damning. The USB files, the blueprints, the detonators. But it was the final batch of documents recovered from the warehouse's encrypted hard drive that silenced the room. Ironwake hadn't just been a militant cell. They had trained dogs, bomb dogs, animals raised to carry explosives into high-value targets. And when one of them refused to obey, when one broke ranks and ran, they had labeled him defective, erased his tag, disavowed him. But Shadow hadn't disappeared. He had returned and saved lives. Reed felt Shadow's shoulder brush against his leg, steady and grounding. The judge's voice filled the room. For the defendants Elias Vaughn and Travis Merle, this court finds you guilty on all counts, sentencing to follow. You are hereby remanded into federal custody. The silence afterward wasn't celebration. It was relief. Outside the courthouse, the wind carried the scent of pine and melting snow. Townsfolk had gathered, neighbors, teachers, even high school kids, clustered near the gazebo where a simple stage had been set. No cameras, no reporters, just Willow Glen. Mayor Cynthia Rollins, a woman with tired eyes and a firm voice, stepped to the microphone. Sometimes the heroes who save us aren't the ones we expect. Sometimes they walk on 4 legs. Sometimes they carry scars from battles we'll never understand. She gestured to the side. Shadow limped forward on command, tail low but wagging, his gait uneven but proud. Reed walked beside him, one hand resting lightly on the shepherd's back. Mayor Rollins held up a small silver badge. Today, we honor Shadow as Hero K9 of Willow Glen. Applause rippled through the square. Reed knelt and gently fastened the badge onto Shadow's collar. The dog blinked once, then sat, facing the crowd like he understood. From the front row, Annette Greer stood slowly, leaning on her cane. Her voice, when she spoke, cracked with emotion. "The Lord sent him," she said, "to warn us. But the miracle wasn't that he came. The miracle was that he stayed. That he chose to love when all he'd been taught was destruction." A hush followed her words. Then, one by one, people approached. First a child from the elementary school Shadow had saved, then a firefighter, then a quiet man from the church. They knelt, one after another, to touch the dog's fur. No words, just hands, just thanks. Shadow bore it all with patience, not as a mascot, but as someone who had earned it. Later that night, as the stars returned and the town fell quiet, Reed stood by the window of his home, looking out across the snow-covered street. Shadow lay nearby, already dozing, the new badge glinting faintly in the firelight. Reed whispered, "You weren't made for war. You were made for this." The shepherd's ear twitched, and in that small, silent moment, Reed understood. Shadow hadn't just survived. He had chosen his side. Snow had begun to melt along the edges of the forest, revealing damp earth and the early shoots of pine grass. The cabin, tucked into the bend of a narrow road just past Elk Hollow, stood quiet and weathered. But to Reed, it looked like peace. No sirens, no courtrooms, no ghosts he wasn't ready to face, just trees, and a dog who had been through hell and come back walking beside him. Shadow padded across the porch, sniffing the air, tail swaying slowly. He paused to watch a squirrel dart through the brush, but made no move to chase it. His shoulder was still stiff from the warehouse explosion, but the burns had healed better than expected. What hadn't healed was something deeper. They were both carrying that. Reed knelt beside him and scratched under his chin. "Feels different, huh? Quiet's not so bad once you stop fearing it." Shadow leaned into the touch, exhaling like he agreed. The cabin wasn't much. A wood stove, 2 small rooms, no signal unless you climbed the ridge. But Reed had stripped it down, rebuilt what needed rebuilding. Jamie had helped him lug in a new generator, and Annette had insisted on leaving homemade quilts, saying, "Dogs don't sleep well in silence unless you wrap them in love." Each night, Reed watched Shadow circle the blanket twice before settling down near the door, always facing outward, always guarding. It wasn't habit. It was duty. And something else. Choice. One morning, just after dawn, Reed opened the front door and saw a strange vehicle parked at the edge of the gravel. Jamie stepped out, holding a manila folder and 2 coffees. He looked older in civilian clothes, but more at ease. Reed raised a brow. "Didn't know we were back on government time." Jamie shrugged. "I figured caffeine was the least I could offer for saving my life." They sat on the steps. Birds called from the trees. The sky was barely lit, but Shadow was already awake, sitting between them, ears perked. Jamie passed the folder over. "The Bureau's starting a new K9 response unit." Shadow's name came up. High-profile protection and trauma detection. He'd work with kids. Vets, anyone the system missed. Reed opened the folder. A glossy badge, a digital chip ID, photos from the courthouse, a letter of commendation with Shadow's name spelled out in full. Shadow, K9 Unit, Civilian Service Recommendation. Jamie added, "It's voluntary, but only if you approve. The dog doesn't serve the Bureau. He partners with it." Reed didn't answer right away. He watched Shadow as the shepherd stood, stretched, then wandered off into the grass to sniff a pile of leaves. He looked content. It wasn't something Reed had seen on him before. "I know what he'd do," Jamie said quietly. "He never backed down from a fight." "That's the point," Reed replied. "He finally doesn't have to." He handed the folder back, untouched. "He's already where he belongs." Jamie nodded. He didn't argue. They watched as Shadow trotted to the edge of the woods, then paused, looking back to check on them. Reed gave a short whistle. Shadow barked once in reply, then came loping back, faster than he should have with that shoulder. Reed caught him at the steps. Later that afternoon, a pickup truck pulled into the drive. In the back seat, 2 young shepherd mixes, scarred and skittish. The driver rolled down the window. "You Reed?" he asked. "Got word you're starting a foster spot for the Recovery K9 program. These 2 don't trust humans. Figured you and your buddy might teach them how." Reed didn't look at the dogs first. He looked at Shadow. The shepherd had stepped forward and was now nose to nose with the pups through the open door. No growl, no challenge. Just that calm, steady gaze. The pups stopped shaking. One of them licked his muzzle. Reed opened the door. "We'll make it work." By sundown, 2 new sleeping spots had been made near the fire. Reed cooked something simple on the stove. The pups were curled up together, occasionally twitching in their sleep. Shadow lay apart, but not distant, as if he understood the importance of space, of time. Outside, the sky turned purple and orange. Inside, for the first time in years, Reed felt a kind of stillness he could live with. He didn't need the world to remember them. He just needed to remember that not all wars end with a flag. Some end with a porch, a blanket, and a dog who finally sleeps soundly. The leaves had turned again, the woods outside the center painted in deep reds and burnt golds. The seasons rolled on quietly in this corner of the world, but inside the old ranger station, now called Haven Ridge, time didn't move the same. For the kids who came through its doors, some limping, some hiding behind walls you couldn't see, it moved in inches. That morning, Reed had just finished clearing the snow-slicked path outside when Jamie arrived with a box of books and a worn duffel bag full of chew toys. A carved wooden sign above the porch creaked in the wind. Shadow's watch was etched in bold, simple letters. Below it, in smaller font, because someone always stayed. Inside, Shadow was already awake, lying by the wood stove. Age had threaded silver into his muzzle, and the scar on his left shoulder stiffened more in the cold now. But his eyes were as alert as ever, his body calm but coiled, like a soldier still listening for the call. Reed greeted Jamie with a nod. They didn't say much anymore. They didn't have to. Later that afternoon, a social worker pulled up with a boy in the back seat. No name was given, only a thin file and a soft warning. 6 months, no words, extreme hypervigilance, fostered 3 times, none stuck. The boy didn't look at Reed when he stepped out, didn't look at the center, just held onto his backpack with a grip that whitened his knuckles, eyes like stone, feet that shuffled as if carrying too much weight for a child that size. Reed opened the door and let him pass without comment. Inside, Shadow didn't move, didn't bark, didn't approach. He simply watched. For hours the boy didn't engage, didn't eat, sat on the edge of the cot like he was waiting for the next thing to fall apart. Reed offered a blanket. The boy didn't touch it. At dusk, while the others gathered near the fire for stories and cocoa, the boy slipped from the room and wandered towards the hallway, toward the dog. Reed saw it but said nothing, just stayed back, watching. Shadow stood as the boy came closer, still no barking, no tail wag, just that low, steady presence he had always carried like armor. The boy hesitated only a second before kneeling. His small hands shook, his eyes welled. Then, barely above a whisper, "You heard me, didn't you?" Shadow didn't flinch. He stepped forward and placed his head against the boy's chest. The child didn't pull back. He dropped his hands into Shadow's fur and held on as if the ground had finally stopped shaking. Tears fell, not in a storm, but like slow rain finally allowed to come. From the doorway, Reed's throat tightened. He didn't move, didn't interrupt the quiet. Later, as the fire burned low and the children drifted to sleep one by one, the boy lay curled beside Shadow, breathing steady, eyelids twitching from the kind of dreams that were no longer only nightmares. Reed walked over and crouched low. He ran a hand down Shadow's side and leaned in. "You always hear them," he whispered, "even when no one else does." Shadow blinked slowly, as if he knew, as if that had always been the point. In the morning, the boy spoke a full sentence. And later that week, when another child arrived screaming and kicking, it was the boy who guided her toward Shadow first. The cycle had begun again. The healing, the staying. Outside, the sun broke through grey clouds, catching the frost on the windows. A new season had begun. Quiet, not easy, but honest. In time, Reed would tell the story again, in classrooms, in VA halls, to tired officers who didn't believe anything good came from the war anymore. He'd show pictures of Shadow, not staged, not in medals, just lying beside broken kids and making them whole in ways words never could. They never asked to be heroes, he'd say. They just stayed. And beneath the carved wooden sign above the entrance, someone had added one more line in charcoal. "What about you? Has anyone, animal or human, ever stayed for you when no one else did? If this story moved you, if Shadow reminded you of someone who never gave up on you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the German Shepherd channel, where every story honors the ones who hear what no one else can. Because sometimes, all it takes is someone who stays.